Everyone laughed when the Omega wanted to help, but the Alpha King took her hand. She was the weakest in the pack, but he saw something no one else did. Subscribe to the channel and discover how this choice changed everything. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers as Arya made her way through the dense woodland surrounding the Moonstone Pack territory. Her bare feet moved silently across the damp earth, a skill she'd developed over years of trying to remain invisible. At 19, she was the smallest and weakest member of her pack, an Omega, whose wolf form was barely larger than a regular wolf, whose strength couldn't match even the youngest Beta, and whose voice carried no authority in pack meetings. The wicker basket in her arms overflowed with medicinal herbs she'd gathered at dawn, moonwort for fever, silverleaf for pain, and the rare bloodroot that grew only in the deepest parts of the forest. While other pack members trained in combat or honed their shifting abilities, Arya had found her calling among the plants and healing arts that most wolves considered beneath their notice. "There she goes again, playing with weeds," sneered Marcus, a young Beta who often made it his mission to remind Arya of her place. He leaned against a towering oak tree, his muscular frame radiating the casual arrogance that came with higher rank. "Don't you have real pack duties to attend to, Omega?" Arya's cheeks burned with familiar shame, but she kept walking. She'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Behind Marcus, she could hear the snickers of his friends, other young wolves who found entertainment in her humiliation. "The pack doesn't need a weak healer when we have real warriors," called out Sandra, a fierce she-wolf whose amber eyes gleamed with disdain. "What good are your little plants going to do when the other packs challenge us?" The words stung because they echoed the doubts that plagued Arya's own thoughts. In a world where strength determined worth, where the ability to fight and defend was paramount, what place was there for someone like her? Even her own parents, both respectable pack members, struggled to hide their disappointment in having an Omega daughter. As she approached the pack's main settlement, a cluster of sturdy wooden buildings nestled in a clearing, Arya could sense the tension in the air. Something was wrong. The usual sounds of daily life were muted, replaced by hushed conversations and worried whispers. Pack members clustered in small groups, their faces etched with concern. Elder Thomas, the pack's aging leader, stood on the steps of the Great Hall, his weathered face grave as he addressed a growing crowd. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his deep voice carried the weight of authority built over decades of leadership. "The sickness has reached the Ironwood Pack," he announced, his words falling like stones into still water. "3 of their strongest warriors fell ill last night. The healers there are baffled. Nothing they've tried has worked." Arya's blood ran cold. For weeks, reports had been filtering in from distant packs about a mysterious illness that struck without warning. Victims would collapse with burning fevers, their wolf forms becoming unstable, shifting uncontrollably between human and animal until exhaustion claimed them. Some died within days. Others survived, but were left permanently weakened, their connection to their wolf spirits severed forever. "What about the other territories?" asked Beta James, Elder Thomas's most trusted advisor. "Any word from the mountain packs or the river clans?" "The same story everywhere," Thomas replied grimly. "The plague spreads faster than we can track it. It's only a matter of time before it reaches us." A collective shiver ran through the assembled pack members. Arya clutched her herb basket tighter, her mind racing through everything she knew about healing and medicine. The traditional remedies weren't working, that much was clear, but there had to be something, some combination of treatments or perhaps some knowledge from the old ways that could help. "Elder Thomas," she found herself saying, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, driven by a desperate need to help despite her lowly status. Every head turned toward her, and Arya felt the familiar weight of dozens of eyes judging her, dismissing her. Elder Thomas's bushy eyebrows raised in surprise. It was unprecedented for an Omega to speak during a pack gathering without being directly addressed. "I've been studying the old healing texts in the archive," she continued, her voice growing slightly stronger despite the tremor in her hands. "There are references to similar plagues in our history. The ancient healers used combinations of rare herbs and other methods." Marcus let out a bark of laughter. "Listen to her. The Omega thinks she can solve what master healers across 5 territories can't." The crowd erupted in similar sounds of derision and amusement. Some pack members actually pointed at her, their laughter sharp and cruel. Arya felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, But something inside her refused to back down. She'd felt this stirring before, a strange certainty that she was meant for something more than the role everyone had assigned her. The old ways speak of healers who could sense the spiritual aspects of illness. She pressed on, raising her voice to be heard over the mockery. Maybe this plague isn't just physical. Maybe it's attacking the bond between human and wolf, and that's why traditional medicine isn't enough. Elder Thomas's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. Omega, Arya, you forget yourself. Return to your duties and leave pack matters to those qualified to handle them. The dismissal hit her like a physical blow, but it was the look of disappointment in the elder's eyes that hurt most. Even he, who had always been kind to her, couldn't see past her rank to consider that she might actually have something valuable to offer. As the crowd began to disperse, still chuckling about the presumptuous Omega who thought she could play healer, Arya stood frozen in place. The herb basket slipped from her numb fingers, spilling carefully gathered plants across the forest floor. Tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over, carving warm tracks down her cheeks. But even through her humiliation and hurt, that strange inner certainty remained. Somewhere in the ancient texts she'd been studying, in the forgotten knowledge of healers who had lived centuries ago, lay the key to stopping this plague. She was sure of it. Now she just had to find a way to prove it, and convince anyone to listen to an Omega who dared to dream beyond her station. 3 days later, the forest trembled with a power unlike anything Arya had ever felt. She was in her small cabin at the edge of the settlement, grinding dried herbs by candlelight, when the sensation hit her like a wave of electricity. Every wolf in the territory would be feeling it, the unmistakable presence of an alpha so powerful that even the earth seemed to acknowledge his dominance. The Alpha King had come to Moonstone Pack. Arya's hands stilled on her mortar and pestle as she listened to the commotion erupting throughout the settlement. Doors slammed, voices called out in excitement and terror, and she could hear the thundering of paws as pack members rushed to the great hall in both human and wolf form. Through her small window, she watched as torches were hastily lit along the main paths, casting dancing shadows across the trees. She should go. Protocol demanded that every pack member present themselves when royalty visited their territory, but the memory of her public humiliation 3 days ago still burned fresh in her mind. She could already imagine the looks, the whispers about the presumptuous Omega who had dared speak out of turn. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. "Arya," called Sarah, one of the few pack members who treated her with basic kindness. "You have to come now. Elder Thomas has ordered every single pack member to attend the king's arrival. No exceptions." With a heavy sigh, Arya set aside her work and reached for her cloak. The rough brown fabric was patched in several places and bore none of the fine embroidery that marked higher-ranking wolves, but it was clean and would have to do. She braided her long auburn hair into a simple plait and followed Sarah into the night. The great hall blazed with light, every torch and lantern in the settlement seemingly gathered to illuminate the space. Pack members lined the walls in strict hierarchical order, elders and betas at the front, regular pack members in the middle, and Omegas relegated to the very back where they could observe but not interfere. Arya took her place among the handful of other Omegas, all of them keeping their eyes downcast as tradition demanded. But she couldn't resist lifting her gaze when the great doors swung open and the Alpha King entered. Darius Blackthorn was nothing like she had imagined. Where she'd expected an older wolf, perhaps graying and weathered by years of rule, she instead saw a man who couldn't be more than 30. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a black leather coat that spoke of both practicality and wealth. His dark hair was pulled back in a style that revealed the strong lines of his face, and his eyes, a striking silver that seemed to glow in the torchlight, missed nothing as they swept across the assembled pack. But it was his presence that truly overwhelmed the space. Power radiated from him in waves that made Arya's wolf whine softly in submission, even as something deeper in her spirit stirred with recognition. This was what a true alpha looked like, not someone who demanded respect through cruelty or politics, but someone who commanded it through sheer force of will and natural authority. "Elder Thomas," the king's voice carried easily through the hall, rich and deep with an accent that spoke of the northern territories. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but the situation has become critical." Thomas bowed deeply, his age-bent form trembling slightly in the presence of such power. "So your Majesty honors us with your presence, though I fear we have little good news to offer. The plague reached your borders yesterday. Darius stated rather than asked. It wasn't a question. Somehow he already knew. 2 pack members fell ill during the night watch. Both young, both strong, both now fighting for their lives. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. No one had announced the illness yet, but somehow the king knew. Arya felt her heart sink as she realized that their territory was no longer safe, that the mysterious sickness had finally found them, despite all their precautions. My healers have tried everything, Darius continued, beginning to pace before the assembled pack. Master physicians from every major territory have examined the victims. We've consulted the ancient texts, tried remedies that haven't been used in centuries. Nothing works. The plague continues to spread and we're running out of time. What can our humble pack offer that the great healers of the kingdom cannot? Elder Thomas asked, confusion evident in his voice. The king stopped pacing and fixed his silver gaze on the elder. Fresh eyes, different perspectives. I've noticed something in my travels. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important message. Sometimes those who are overlooked hold the keys that everyone else has missed. Arya's breath caught in her throat. It was as if he was speaking directly to her, though his eyes hadn't found her in the crowd of Omegas. Her heart began to race as she remembered her interrupted words from 3 days ago, the certainty she'd felt about the spiritual nature of the plague. I'm calling upon every member of every pack to contribute their knowledge, Darius declared. Healer or warrior, elder or youth, alpha or omega, if you have any insight, any theory, any suggestion that might help us understand this plague, I want to hear it. The silence that followed was deafening. Pack members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other with uncertainty. It was unprecedented for a king to ask for input from lower-ranking wolves, let alone omegas. The very suggestion challenged centuries of established hierarchy. Your Majesty, Elder Thomas said carefully, surely you don't mean to suggest that common pack members might possess knowledge that our master healers lack? Something dangerous flashed in the king's silver eyes. I mean to suggest, Elder, that desperation calls for desperate measures. I've watched strong alphas die while their healers stood helplessly by. I've seen entire bloodlines wiped out because we were too proud to consider that wisdom might come from unexpected sources. His gaze swept the crowd again, and this time Arya felt the full weight of his attention as those silver eyes found hers across the crowded hall. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, King and Omega stared at each other, and Arya felt something pass between them, a recognition, a challenge, a spark of possibility that made her wolf spirit howl with sudden hope. So I ask again, Darius said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall while his eyes remained locked on Arya's. Does anyone have any insight that might help us save our people? The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Arya felt every eye in the hall upon her, felt the weight of expectation and mockery and disbelief. She could remain silent, keep her theories to herself, and avoid the humiliation that would surely follow. Or she could speak, knowing that this might be the only chance to save not just her pack, but all the pack suffering from this mysterious plague. Her decision came not from her mind, but from somewhere deeper, from the part of her that had always known she was meant for something more than the role others had assigned her. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at her to remain invisible, Arya stepped forward from the crowd of Omegas. I do, Your Majesty, she said, her voice clear and strong despite the trembling in her hands. I believe I might know what's really happening. The silence that followed Arya's words was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Every pack member stood frozen, their expressions ranging from shock to outright horror that an Omega had dared to address the Alpha King directly. Marcus was the first to break the silence with a harsh laugh. Your Majesty, please forgive our pack's lowest member. She clearly doesn't understand proper protocol. Silence? The king's single word cut through the air like a blade, carrying such absolute authority that Marcus immediately stepped back, his face pale. Darius's silver eyes never left Arya's face as he spoke. I believe I asked for insights, not commentary on protocol. Continue, Omega. Arya's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to step forward again, moving closer to the center of the hall where the king stood. She could feel the disapproval radiating from her packmates like heat from a fire, but something about the king's steady gaze gave her strength. Your Majesty, she began, her voice growing steadier with each word, I've spent months studying the ancient healing texts in our archive. There are references to a plague that struck our kind nearly 500 years ago, one with symptoms identical to what we're seeing now. Elder Thomas shifted uncomfortably. The archives are restricted to scholars and, "Let her speak," Darius commanded, his tone brooking no argument. He gestured for Arya to continue, and she felt a flutter of gratitude mixed with terror at his support. "The old text describes something called the Soul Sever," Arya continued, her confidence building as she delved into knowledge she'd memorized through countless hours of secret study. It wasn't just a physical illness, it was a spiritual attack that targeted the sacred bond between human and wolf spirits. That's why traditional medicines don't work. They're treating the symptoms, not the cause. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but the king raised his hand for silence. "Go on." "What caused this soul sever?" Arya took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either vindicate her or destroy any credibility she might have gained. "According to the texts, it was triggered by a disruption in the natural magical balance of our territories. Something or someone was draining the spiritual energy that maintains the bonds between our two natures." "Ridiculous," scoffed Beta James. "Magic isn't some finite resource that can be drained. Our bonds with our wolves are sacred gifts from the moon goddess herself." But King Darius was studying Arya with intense focus, his silver eyes sharp with interest. "These ancient texts, do they mention how the plague was stopped?" "They do," Arya said, her heart racing as she realized he was actually listening to her, actually considering her words. "It required a ritual performed at the source of the magical disruption, a place where the spiritual energy was being siphoned away. But it couldn't be done by just anyone. The ritual required someone with an unusual connection to the old magic, someone who could sense the spiritual currents that most wolves can't perceive." The king was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Arya's face. When he spoke, his words sent a shock through the assembled pack. "You can sense these currents, can't you?" It wasn't really a question, and Arya found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "I've always been able to feel things. The health of the forest, the mood of the pack before they know it themselves, the spiritual weight of places and people. I thought everyone could, until I realized I was the only one who knew when storms were coming days before they arrived, or who could sense illness in pack members before any symptoms appeared." "The girl is delusional," Marcus muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Several pack members were looking at Arya with new eyes, remembering instances where she had seemed to know things she shouldn't have been able to know. King Darius stepped closer to Arya, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. This close, she could see flecks of darker silver in his eyes, and she could feel the overwhelming power that surrounded him like a second skin. But there was something else too, a weariness, a burden that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "3 days ago you tried to share this knowledge with your pack," he said quietly, though his words carried clearly through the silent hall. "They laughed at you." Arya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she nodded. "They did, but that doesn't make the knowledge less true." A ghost of a smile touched the king's lips. "No, it doesn't." He turned to address the crowd, his voice resuming its commanding tone. "I've traveled to 17 territories in the past month. I've consulted with the most learned healers, the most powerful alphas, the most ancient elders. None of them could offer me anything more than theories and failed treatments." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Yet here, in a single evening, an Omega who has been dismissed and ridiculed has provided me with more actionable information than all those experts combined." The implication of his words hit the pack like a physical blow. Elder Thomas looked as if he'd aged 10 years in as many minutes, while Marcus and the other young wolves who had mocked Arya stood frozen in shock and growing shame. "Your Majesty," Elder Thomas said weakly, "surely you don't intend to take her seriously, to value insight over rank, to prioritize saving our people over maintaining social hierarchies." The king's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Yes, Elder, that's exactly what I intend to do." He turned back to Arya, and his expression softened slightly. "These texts you've studied, do they indicate where we might find this source of the magical disruption?" Arya nodded eagerly, her mind racing through the passages she'd memorized. "There are descriptions of a place called the Heart of Shadows, a location where multiple ley lines converge, creating a natural focal point for spiritual energy. The texts suggest it's hidden deep in the Whispering Woods, protected by ancient wards that make it nearly impossible to find." "Nearly impossible," the king repeated thoughtfully, "but not completely impossible. Not for someone with the right kind of sensitivity to magical currents. The implication was clear, and Arya felt her breath catch. He was suggesting that she guide him to this legendary location, that an Omega who had never traveled beyond her pack's borders should lead the Alpha King into uncharted territory in search of a place that might exist only in ancient stories. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "I should mention that the texts also warn of guardians, creatures bound to protect the heart of shadows from those who would misuse its power. The ritual site won't be undefended." Instead of discouraging him, this information seemed to energize the king. His silver eyes gleamed with the first hope Arya had seen in them. "Then we'll face whatever guards it. The question is, Omega Arya of the Moonstone Pack, are you willing to help me save our people?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond a simple yes or no. If she agreed, she would be leaving everything she'd ever known to venture into deadly territory with the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. If she refused, she might be condemning countless wolves to death from a plague that would continue to spread unchecked. But as she looked into the king's eyes, saw the desperation he was trying to hide behind his royal composure, her choice became clear. This was what that inner certainty had been preparing her for, not a life of quiet service to an ungrateful pack, but a chance to use her unique gifts to make a real difference. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "I'll help you find the Heart of Shadows." The dawn broke grey and misty over the Moonstone Pack territory, as Arya stood at the edge of the settlement with a travel pack slung over her shoulders. The king had wasted no time. They would leave immediately before the plague could claim any more victims. Every hour of delay meant more wolves falling ill, more families torn apart by a disease that defied all conventional treatment. She had spent the remaining hours of the night gathering supplies, her precious collection of rare herbs, the ancient texts she'd managed to copy by hand, a few changes of clothes, and the simple silver pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who, according to family whispers, had possessed similar unusual sensitivities to magic. The king emerged from the great hall accompanied by two of his personal guards, wolves whose very presence spoke of deadly competence and absolute loyalty. Captain Reed, a scarred veteran with graying temples, and Lieutenant Maya, a younger woman whose amber eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the surrounding forest. Both wore the dark blue and silver that marked them as royal guard, and both carried weapons that gleamed with the subtle sheen of enchanted metal. "Are you certain about this, Your Majesty?" Captain Reed asked quietly, his voice carrying the familiarity of someone who had served the royal family for years. Venturing into the Whispering Woods with only 4 wolves, relying on ancient texts and the word of an untested Omega, Darius adjusted the straps of his own pack, his movements economical and precise. "I'm certain that every conventional approach has failed, Reed. I'm certain that people are dying while we debate proper protocol, and I'm certain that this untested Omega has provided more useful information in one evening than entire councils of advisors have managed in weeks." Arya felt a warm flush of gratitude at his defense, though she couldn't shake the awareness that she was about to lead the Alpha King into potentially deadly territory based on nothing more than half-remembered passages from ancient texts and her own uncertain abilities. Elder Thomas approached their small group, his weathered face creased with worry. "Your Majesty, if I may, perhaps it would be wise to send scouts ahead to verify the safety of the path you intend to take. The Whispering Woods don't respond well to traditional scouting," Arya interjected, then immediately flushed as she realized she had spoken without being addressed. "I'm sorry, I only meant—" "Don't apologize for sharing relevant information," the king said firmly. "What do you mean about the woods not responding to traditional scouting?" Arya glanced nervously at Elder Thomas, who gave her a tight nod of permission to continue. "The ancient texts describe the Whispering Woods as a place where the normal rules don't apply. Paths that exist one day vanish the next. Landmarks shift position. Scouts who enter with detailed maps emerge confused and lost, having found nothing that resembles what they were looking for." Lieutenant Maya raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like fairy tales designed to keep people out of dangerous territory." "Maybe," Arya conceded. "But the texts also say that the woods respond to intention and need, rather than simple navigation. Those who enter with pure purpose and urgent necessity find paths that others can't see." "Convenient," Captain Reed muttered, but the king held up a hand to silence him. "We'll test the theory soon enough," Darius said. "If the Omega's guidance proves accurate, we continue. If not, we retreat, and find another approach. He turned to Elder Thomas. I'm leaving instructions that if we're not back within 7 days, you're to send word to the capital immediately. My brother will know how to proceed. The mention of the king having a brother surprised Arya, though she supposed it made sense that there would be other members of the royal family. She filed the information away, focusing instead on the enormity of what they were about to attempt. As their small group prepared to depart, pack members began emerging from their homes to witness the unprecedented sight of their Alpha King setting off into the unknown with their lowest-ranking member as a guide. The expressions ranged from awe to disbelief to poorly concealed skepticism. Marcus stood among the crowd, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. 3 days ago, he had been laughing at Arya's presumption. Now she was about to embark on a quest that could determine the fate of their entire species. If she succeeded, she would be celebrated as a hero. If she failed, she would likely be remembered as the Omega, whose delusions led the Alpha King to his death. "Arya," a soft voice called out, and she turned to see her mother approaching. Eleanor's face was drawn with worry, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Please be careful, daughter. I know I've never been the mother you deserved, but I do love you." The unexpected declaration brought tears to Arya's eyes. Her relationship with her parents had always been strained by their disappointment in having an Omega child, their inability to understand her strange gifts, their constant worry about her place in pack hierarchy. "I love you too, Mother," Arya whispered, accepting the fierce hug that Elena wrapped around her. "I'll come back, I promise." "See that you do," her mother said gruffly, pulling away to wipe her eyes. "And bring our king back safely too." The farewells were brief. They couldn't afford to linger when every moment of delay meant more potential victims of the plague. As they approached the tree line that marked the beginning of the deep forest, Arya felt the familiar tingle that indicated her supernatural senses were awakening. The spiritual currents of the forest washed over her like invisible rivers, carrying information about the health of the trees, the mood of the wildlife, the subtle wrongness that had been growing stronger over the past months. "This way," she said, pointing toward a barely visible deer path that wound between ancient oaks. "The ley lines are strongest in that direction." King Darius fell into step beside her, while his guards flanked them on either side, their hands resting casually on their weapons. The formation spoke of long practice and absolute trust. These wolves had protected their king through countless dangers, and they would do so again even if they doubted the wisdom of this particular mission. As they walked deeper into the forest, Arya became aware of the king's presence in ways that had nothing to do with his physical proximity. His spiritual energy was unlike anything she had ever encountered, vast and controlled, like a barely contained storm that could be unleashed at a moment's notice. But there was something else too, something that made her wolf spirit respond with recognition and longing. "Tell me about your abilities," he said quietly, as they navigated around a fallen log. "When did you first realize you could sense things others couldn't?" Arya considered the question, thinking back to her earliest memories. "I was very young, maybe 5 or 6. I kept crying whenever my grandfather visited, even though he seemed healthy, and everyone said I was being silly. 2 weeks later, he collapsed from a heart condition no one knew he had." "And your family's reaction?" "They were uncomfortable," she admitted. "My parents hoped I would grow out of it. The pack healers suggested I might have some minor psychic sensitivity, but nothing worth developing. Everyone assumed that if I had any real gifts, they would have manifested more powerfully." The king was quiet for a moment, his silver eyes focused on the path ahead. When he spoke, his voice carried a thoughtful tone. "In my experience, the most powerful gifts often come in unexpected packages. Perhaps your sensitivity was never meant to manifest as raw power. Perhaps it was meant to manifest as precisely what we need right now." His words sent a warm flutter through Arya's chest, but she forced herself to focus on the path ahead. The spiritual currents were growing stronger, and she could sense something else now, a darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose somewhere deeper in the woods. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I think we're getting close to something. The magical balance here feels wrong, twisted." Darius immediately signaled for a halt, his guards instantly alert and scanning the surrounding forest. "Wrong how?" Arya closed her eyes, extending her supernatural senses as far as she dared. What she felt made her stomach clench with dread. "It's like something is feeding on the natural magic of this place, draining it away for some other purpose. The trees are starting to weaken, The wildlife is fleeing, and the spiritual energy that should be flowing freely is being harvested. When she opened her eyes, she found all three of her companions watching her intently. The king's expression was grim but unsurprised, as if her words had confirmed his worst fears. "Then we're on the right path," he said grimly, "and we're running out of time." The deeper they ventured into the whispering woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Ancient trees towered overhead, their branches intertwined so thickly that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated the canopy. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that should have been brown and gold with autumn's touch, but instead appeared drained of color, as if something had leached the very life from them. Arya led the way, her supernatural senses guiding them along paths that seemed to shift and change when no one was looking directly at them. More than once, Captain Reed had stopped to mark a tree with his knife, only to discover minutes later that the mark had vanished and the tree looked completely different. "The wards are strong here," Arya murmured, pausing beside a stream that flowed uphill in defiance of natural law. "We're getting close to the heart of shadows. I can feel it pulling at the magic in my blood." King Darius moved up beside her, his silver eyes scanning the impossible landscape. "What kind of defenses should we expect?" Before Arya could answer, the forest around them began to change. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made every wolf's instincts scream warnings. Shadows deepened between the trees, and within those shadows, shapes began to move. "Guardian spirits," Arya breathed, her voice tight with fear and awe. "The texts mentioned them, but I didn't expect them to be so massive," Lieutenant Maya finished grimly, her hand moving to the enchanted blade at her side. The creatures that emerged from the darkness were unlike anything any of them had ever seen. They stood nearly 10 feet tall, their forms shifting between solid shadow and wisps of dark energy. Their eyes burned with an otherworldly fire that spoke of ancient magic and terrible purpose. There were 3 of them, positioning themselves to block every possible escape route. "Who dares approach the heart of shadows?" The voice came from all 3 guardians simultaneously, echoing with the weight of centuries. "Who seeks to disturb the sacred balance?" King Darius stepped forward, his royal presence blazing like a beacon in the oppressive darkness. "I am Darius Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. I come seeking to restore the balance that has been corrupted, to heal the plague that threatens to destroy our people." The Guardians' burning gazes fixed on him, and Arya could feel the weight of their assessment. "Many have claimed noble purpose while harboring dark intentions. What proof do you offer of your sincerity?" "This," Darius said simply, and to Arya's shock, he reached out and took her hand. The moment their skin touched, power exploded through both of them. Arya gasped as she felt the full force of the king's spiritual energy merging with her own supernatural sensitivity. Through their joined hands, she could suddenly perceive the magical currents of the entire forest with crystalline clarity, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Deep beneath the forest floor, something ancient and malevolent had sunk massive spiritual roots into the ley lines that converged at the heart of shadows. It was feeding on the magical energy that maintained the bonds between human and wolf spirits, growing stronger while their people grew weaker. The plague wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was the side effect of this parasitic entity's feeding, but she also sensed something else. The Guardians weren't just testing their intentions, they were waiting for someone with the right combination of power and sensitivity to attempt the cleansing ritual. For 500 years they had been holding this creature at bay, preventing it from consuming all the magical energy in the region, but they couldn't destroy it. That required a living wolf with both the spiritual sensitivity to perceive it and the power to banish it. "You see it now," the Guardians said, their voices carrying a note of relief. "The shadow feeder has awakened from its centuries-long slumber. It grows stronger with each spirit bond it severs, each connection it consumes." "How do we stop it?" Darius asked, his hand tightening around Arya's. Through their connection, she could feel his determination burning like a forge fire. "The ritual must be performed at the convergence point," the Guardians explained, their forms beginning to fade as their purpose was fulfilled. "But beware. The creature will not submit without a fight. It has grown powerful in its time of feeding, and it will use every corrupted energy at its disposal to defend itself." As the Guardians dissolved back into shadow, the path ahead cleared, revealing a clearing bathed in an eerie, pulsing light. At its center stood a circle of ancient stones, each one carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when looked at directly. The very air above the stones rippled with distorted energy, and from somewhere far below, a sound like a heartbeat echoed through the earth. "That's it," Arya whispered, her voice barely audible over the spiritual noise emanating from the convergence point, the heart of shadows. Captain Reed and Lieutenant Meyer took defensive positions at the edge of the clearing, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning for threats. But Arya knew that no physical weapon would be effective against what they were about to face. As she and the king approached the stone circle, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the earth, and from those cracks seeped a darkness that was more than mere absence of light. It was corruption made manifest, hunger given form, the antithesis of everything that made their people whole. "The ritual," Arya said urgently, pulling the copied text from her pack with her free hand. "I need to begin the chant while you channel your power through the ley lines. But, Your Majesty, once I start, I won't be able to stop. If something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Darius said with absolute conviction. "We've come too far and our people have suffered too much for us to fail now." Arya nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. She began to recite the ancient words, her voice growing stronger and more resonant with each syllable. The language was older than their written history, a tongue that spoke directly to the primal forces that governed magic itself. As the chant filled the clearing, the darkness that had been seeping from the cracks suddenly exploded upward. The shadow feeder revealed itself in all its terrible glory, a writhing mass of corrupted energy, the size of a building, with tendrils that reached out like hungry fingers toward every source of spiritual power it could sense. Darius stepped into the stone circle, his own power blazing to life around him like silver flame. The creature turned its attention toward him, recognizing the threat he represented, but Arya continued chanting, her voice now echoing with supernatural force as the ancient ritual took hold. The battle that followed was unlike anything the clearing had ever witnessed. The shadow feeder lashed out with tendrils of pure corruption, trying to drain the king's power and add it to its own reserves. But Darius was no ordinary alpha. His royal bloodline carried magic that had been refined and strengthened over generations, and he wielded it with the skill of a master warrior. Silver fire met living darkness in the space above the stone circle. Each clash sent shockwaves through the spiritual fabric of the forest, and Arya had to pour every ounce of her own energy into maintaining the ritual chant that would bind the creature and force it back to the void from which it had emerged. But the shadow feeder had been feeding for months, growing stronger with each bond it severed. It began to press forward, its darkness threatening to overwhelm even the king's formidable power. Arya felt despair beginning to creep into her heart as she realized that they might not be strong enough. Then, in the moment when failure seemed inevitable, she felt something new flow through their joined hands. It wasn't just the king's power or her own sensitivity. It was the combined spiritual energy of every wolf whose bond had been damaged by the plague, every family that had lost a loved one, every pack that refused to give up hope. The realization hit her like lightning. She wasn't just channeling her own abilities or the king's power. She was connected, through the ley lines and through the ancient ritual, to every wolf in the kingdom. All of their hopes, their determination, their love for their people flowed through her and into the binding spell. With this new surge of power, the ritual reached its crescendo. The shadow feeder's scream of rage and defeat echoed across multiple planes of existence as it was torn away from the ley lines it had been parasitizing. The creature fought desperately, but it could not stand against the combined will of an entire people united in their desire to protect what they held dear. In a final burst of silver light, the shadow feeder was banished back to the void, its hold on their world severed permanently. The corrupted darkness that had been seeping from the earth was drawn back into the cracks, which sealed themselves with crystalline chimes that spoke of magic being restored to its proper balance. Arya's voice finally fell silent as the last words of the ritual faded into the evening air. She and Darius stood in the center of the stone circle, still holding hands, surrounded by the gentle glow of magic, flowing freely once again through its natural channels. "It's done," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "The bonds are restored. The plague will begin to fade within hours." King Darius turned to face her, his silver eyes bright with triumph and something deeper, a respect and admiration that had nothing to do with rank or station and everything to do with recognizing true worth when he saw it. "You did it," he said softly. You saved our people. We did it, Arya corrected, acutely aware that their hands were still joined, that the connection between them felt stronger than ever. Your power, my sensitivity, our people's hope. It took all of it. As they made their way back toward the forest edge, Captain Reed and Lieutenant Meyer falling into step behind them, Arya couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in just a few days. She had entered these woods as a dismissed Omega whose own pack barely tolerated her presence. She was leaving as someone who had helped save their entire species. But more than that, she was leaving with the knowledge that her gifts, the sensitivity that had always made her feel like an outsider, were exactly what the world had needed. Sometimes the smallest voice did carry the most important message. Sometimes those who were overlooked did hold the keys that everyone else had missed. And sometimes, just sometimes, an Omega and an Alpha King could work together to achieve something that neither could have accomplished alone. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Arya looked forward to a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The plague would end, their people would heal, and she would finally have found her true place in a world that had always made her feel like she didn't belong. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest power lay not in commanding others, but in having the courage to speak truth when everyone else had given up hope.